Hey everyone, welcome to TalksOnWeb.com. Today I'll be talking about the exceptions class in PHP. There's some few points that I'll go over, and which is the difference between an error and an exception, the basics, the customization, exception chaining, and exception code. Let's start with the exceptions versus the errors. In your application, if you try to call test1 and you haven't defined the function test1, what you're doing is you're going to get an error, and which is obvious. But what is an exception then? If you know what an error is, an exception, if you look at the word in itself, means something that is out of the ordinary, something you don't expect to happen. So if I create my application, I debug it and everything, and I deploy it, later on my database server fails, for whatever reason, I can have my application, see, that's something that happens out of the ordinary. I can have my application using the exceptions class send me an email telling me that, hey, this is something that has happened, and then I can have my application degrade gracefully. So this would be a very great way of doing that, and it's we'll look into the whole thing right now. So now let's get started with the basics, and the basics are, here's the try block, and what I do is I write the keyword try, and inside that block I place in the code that I think is gonna cause me the most problems, like connecting to a database. Or another case is you have a user uploading their company's information along with their logo. Now later on, when they go to the members page and they can't access that logo, they don't see it anywhere, that's a problem. What you can do is you can have your exception look for these kind of problems and then email you that information. So rather than wait for the user to walk up to you and say, here's a problem with your website, you can actually take care of it yourself. If you're maintaining an application, this is great. So inside this try block, I place in code that I think is going to be problematic. Then afterwards, I write down the keyword catch, and I go from there. So if you look at line number 5, what I do is I say, if I can't connect to the database, I want you to throw a new exception, and I want you to throw them this message, which is I can't connect to the database. I'll write down whatever you want that is descriptive. As soon as I write this, all the other code that is in the try block is not going to be run, because I threw an exception. And then I get thrown right to line number 8. It catches the exception object. If you notice, we use the keyword new. So that means we're creating an object of the exceptions class, and then we're throwing that object to line number 8, which is ready to catch it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use this object to get all the information about the error. Now, for those of you that haven't gone to the PHP website, it's very helpful. If you go to this URL, what you're going to see is it defines the whole exception class for us. So inside this class, there's the message. The message is something that we set personally. Then there's the file. The file is something that the application is going to feed in itself. It's going to tell you which file this problem occurred in, and which particular line in that file is causing this problem. So you get all this information just by using that class. I'm not going to touch on code until more towards the end of the tutorial, and you'll find out why. And if you look at the methods that we get along with this class, the first one is a constructor. And if you go back to the code, you'll notice that when I said throw new exception, new is going to cause us to create a new object of the exceptions class, and this is the constructor that we're calling, and we pass in the message. So as soon as we did this, an object was created and it was thrown to this place. So there's the constructor. Aside from the message, we can throw in the code and an exception object. These two things I'll cover more towards the end of the tutorial. Right now I'm just trying to look at the basics in case you haven't seen exceptions before. Okay, so aside from that, we have the get message method. This is going to allow us to get the message. You probably created getters and setters in your application, so you know where I'm going with this. There's a get file, there's a get line, and there's other methods that are not going to make sense now until I start explaining them. So let's go back to the beginning, and that is inside the try block, we place in code that might fail. You can't connect to a database, throw the exception object, it gets thrown here, and as soon as we catch the exception object, you can name it whatever you want. I chose to go with E. I tried calling the get message method. Okay, and the get message is going to get me the error message, which is this, and we can display it to the screen, we can email it, we can do whatever we want with it, and then we can direct the user in a very smooth way as to what's going on. So let's actually do this. I'm going to go to my application, And what you'll see is I've created a user class. Inside the user class there's this one method that's getCompanyInfo, and what I've done is rather than pull it from the database, let's just say that a user has uploaded an image of their logo and this is the path to that image. I know that there's a path and I check to see if the file exists. Is there an actual image on my server? If it's not, if it's there, we do something interesting like show it to them or allow them to edit it or whatever it is. If it's not there, I know there's a problem. There's a path in my database saying that yes, something was uploaded and it's in this location, and if it's not there, there's a problem in my logic. I need to go take care of that. So I go here and I say if the file doesn't exist, I want you to throw a new object of the exception class, and I want you to put this information in there. And it can access the company icon of the user, and I can put in the user ID. The user ID could be in any of the, if you stored it in the sessions or wherever you store the information, you place it here, and you can email it to yourself, you can save it into the database, and then there's the exception code. Since I placed it here, I'll tell you a little bit about it. The exception code is basically allowing you to categorize your exceptions. Okay, so what that means is if I know that I'm going to have problems with my database, I know I'm going to have problems with my users changing their passwords or updating their icons or whatever it is, I can categorize that. I can say any exception that begins with 1 is the database related exception. Any exception that begins with 2 is a problem that the user is having updating their members info, and so forth. And I can keep creating this, and what I'll do is I'll put this inside of my database. So whenever a database exception occurs, I can't exactly save it into the database but I can email it to myself later on, go and add it to the database. Whenever the user can't update their members info, I can save that to the database. I can have one of those log tables, and at the end of the month I can go into that table and just run a query simply and say how many member related problems did they have, exceptions did they have, how many times did we have problem with the database, how many times did we have problem with so and so another area of the application. And that small query is going to allow me to see how many logical problems I have, how they're resolved, and just move forward from there. So this is very informative. That's what the exception code is in a nutshell. I might go over this later on. So this is our simple application, a simple class. Now I'm going to say the try block, and I'll say I'm going to create an object, user object. I'll say create a new user object. We have it here. We'll say let's call this method, okay, and I know as soon as I call this file doesn't exist, an exception is going to be thrown, so I need to create a catch block. So I create a catch block like here, and I'm expecting an exception object, so I'll call it E, and I'll say give me the get. Now as soon as I type get, my ID is giving me all the method that belongs to this object, and I want the get message for now. I'll say get message, and after that I can say also here's the line that belongs to that message, and I can say E get line, and I can also say here's the file. So let's move here and say get file. So I'm putting all this information out to the screen. You're not going to do that, obviously. You're going to do a lot of other things. You might even save it to your database, you might email it to yourself, and to the user you'll give a completely different information. So this is the basics of it. Okay, now we're going to move on to the actual side of it. Let's actually run this part. Okay, let's go here. Here's my basics, and I'll run it. Something has gone wrong. Okay, so let's look at the code. I tried to call this code. I know an error exception is going to be thrown. As soon as that exception is thrown, I show up here in the exceptions object, and I did not say echo. So as soon as I do that, it says, here's your message, can't access the company icon of the user so-and-so. This has occurred on line 9 of file so-and-so. Okay, so it's simple enough. Let's move on to the other part of it. So that's the basics, and now we're at customizing the exception. We've grown so fast. Now, in customizing the exception, we don't just have to throw the exceptions object. We can customize this to look like DB related exception. And inside the DB related exception, we can do much more with that. So let me show you what I mean by this. Let me go here and just kind of do this. Now, rather than just say exception, 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 we know what the exception class is about. But we can extend the exception class and create our own personalized exception. So if something is happening with the database, I know I'm not going to go to the database and try to save that exception. I need to do something different. I can save it to the log file, I can send an email, but I can't save it to the database. I need to treat this differently. So what I'll do is I'll say create a class called DB exception. You can name it anything you want, but I put exception at the end of all of mine because this way I know what this class is about. And then I say extends the exception class that PHP has, and then I can just move forward. I don't have to define anything in here, but if I want to, I can go ahead and I can say function so and so. Okay, I can say function send email, and in here I can say get the email info. In here I can set the code to grab all the information about the message, the error message that I have, the line it occurred on, the user this problem occurred for, and then I can email that person. So I can use this now. Okay, let's say I print out echo the email has been sent. I'm making this brief because if I go into the details of it, it'll just be annoying for me, not so much for you. So now what I do next is I write down my code, which is let's say try if, in this case we'll set true, true. Okay, so in this case there was a problem and we want to throw an exception, so we'll say throw new, and we won't say exception this time, but we'll say DB exception, the one we just created up here. Okay, and for those of you wondering which ID I'm using Aptana. It's really good, you might want to try it out. So I'll say DB exception,